Hi, I'm going to talk in some detail about the process of making this painting because I think it will illuminate the experience of looking at it and some of the subtle aspects of the visual experience that the viewer has. Now, this is a very simple image. It, it has fairly few elements in it, and it was made fairly quickly, fairly few steps. It started with a 18 by 24 inch piece of paper, which I folded in half, and I cut out this figure, a human figure with an eye for a head. And I may have used this stencil to make some other paintings with. Before I added these additional elements to it, I put these snakes, I cut them out of the paper, and I cut around the perimeter of the figure. Now, I did those things afterwards, and I didn't fold the paper. That's why these elements are not symmetrical, because they were made after. Same with this cutout perimeter. That's why it is irregular and asymmetrical. Those are subtle differences, but when the elements are reduced so much, these subtle things, they have a definite effect. Now, the image was painted with black and white acrylic paint, applied very freely in a sort of abstract expressionist sensibility on an intimate scale. And you can see that the background color is lighter at the bottom and then darker at the top, so there is a kind of a landscape and sky orientation happening. It's subtle, but it's there, and I did that so that there can be more of a sense of depth, a sense of deep space happening in this image, even though it's a very frontal and on the surface kind of image. And that's a duality that I like to use a lot. An image that's very pattern oriented or iconic and on the surface, and a deep space. Using the stencil with this type of brushwork is very satisfying for me, because I can be very loose and free with the way I put the paint on, which is very pleasurable for me. And the form will still have a nice, graceful line from the cutout stencil. So I like that subtle tension between the loose and free brush strokes that are contained within this nice, graceful contour. The last thing I did was to put on these little glowing balls. And they're something that I've used a lot for years. And I really enjoy using them because they're fun to make, and they bring a different kind of visual resolution to the image. They invoke a sort of realistic painted space in the way that this gestural brushwork does not. And it brings that gestural brushwork into that visual perspective. So again, it's a subtle tension between two different kinds of visual experience. The visual experience of the loose brush strokes, which has its own kind of emotional payload, and these glowing balls, which incidentally, as far as the placement of these, a lot of times I'll put them where there is something I don't like a drip or a brushstroke that I don't like. So they're very useful for that, and that also adds a kind of randomization to their placement. They're like a kind of seasoning, that I would put on this, like pepper on a salad or something. So that's an illustration of the way these things develop, and the viewer, when they're looking at it, the way their eye moves through it and the way they absorb the image, I think it kind of follows on an unconscious level. It follows the pathway of the process of making it. And that's assuming that someone takes the time to look at this image for that length of time. Okay. Well, I'd say that that covers that aspect of it.